Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. At this point, my marketing team suggested a lengthy piece on why more boards should be using Nurole to hire their next chair, non-executive director, trustee, or board advisor. Rather than bore you with that, I'll cut to the chase. We're the market leader in the board space, doing 1,000 board placements annually, and we focus exclusively on non-executive appointments, giving us deep and current board search expertise. Our members tell us they want more roles. If every person listening now could send just one board role Nurole's way in the next 3 years, opportunities will increase exponentially for everyone. As the saying goes, communities grow great when people plant trees whose shade they will never know. Today's guest, Jane Routledge, is a marketeer, psychologist, and non-executive director in the investment sector. After an executive career focused on marketing and communicating about investments, latterly as marketing director and partner at Seven Investment Management, Jane recently moved into the non-executive world. She is currently on the boards of M&G Credit Income Investment Trust and Brown Advisory US Smaller Companies Trust, as well as the Cumbria Education Trust, a multi-academy trust running 14 schools. Jane, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Jane, you've made the transition from executive to non-executive work. And one of the most common questions I get from those thinking about board roles is it something that they would enjoy? Would they be right for it? And how do they go about getting a role? I'm really interested to know how you thought about the first part of that. Why did you make that transition from a successful executive career into the non-executive role?
Okay, my timing was serendipitous, but also a little stressy looking back on it. I left my last executive position in December 2019. So 2 months before the world, as we knew it, ground to a halt for a few months. So I had 6 months during the beginning of the global pandemic, the first lockdowns, of really, enforced reflection on what I was going to do. I'd left knowing that I needed to do something different. I knew that this last 30 years, it had been a great experience, but it was now time for a change. I didn't know what the change was at the time, and I explored one or two things which were quite outside of the investment sector. I concluded that they didn't give me the flexibility and they didn't build on the experience I'd got. So basically, by the end of the first summer of all those lockdowns, I knew where I was headed. I knew I wanted to find some roles that helped me be part of organizations, but not in such a full-on way. And also where I could bring to bear the experience I'd had, but also ideally build a portfolio where I also had something that was a little outside of investment, just because, you need to get out of your comfort zone.
And what were the biggest surprises for you when you started exploring that non-exec world?
It was lonely. I don't know that I thought about it before. So I was surprised that I was so on my own during that journey. And I think that was in large part, again, my timing made that worse. Also, I wasn't, for the first time in 32 years, I didn't have another full-time occupation. And my family were more independent and all those things. So this was kind of all about me. And it was slightly uncomfortable.
Interesting. And what gave you the confidence that you had the requisite, I suppose, skills, experience for it? I often hear people from some very accomplished backgrounds just asking, like, how do I know if I'm going to be able to do this
Yeah.
role before they've actually got a position?
Yeah. I think the truth is that you've sort of got to jump in the end. You can't absolutely know. There is that strange mixture of apprehension and also confidence. And you need a bit of both, because if I walked in thinking, well, this is a piece of cake, um, I wouldn't be a great candidate because I would be too complacent. I suppose I started from the point of view of I have a depth of background in a lot of marketing across a lot of different audiences across the investment world. And I have lived that experience through a time when financial services and investment have changed so remarkably all the way through those 30 years. There's been a massive change in regulation, a massive change in the requirements for individuals to look after themselves. So I've lived all of that. Somehow in all of that, there must be experience, understanding that's of use somewhere. I didn't know where, but my rational brain told me all of that. My emotional brain at times still felt like, oh, I wish somebody would tell me this will all work out okay.
That's it. Now, okay, so you figured out that this was something you wanted to explore. You thought you had what it took.
Mhm.
What was your strategy then for getting those roles?
Okay. I think it was twofold. And part of it was a strategy, and part of it was digging about. I mean, my strategy was to prepare myself in terms of get to the point where I do have a board profile that's on one page. And I've seen some that were on 6 or 8. I ended up with one that was on one page. And it didn't just explain what I'd done, but I tried to explain what I might provide through what I'd done with the evidence of what I'd done. So, board profile, LinkedIn, which made sense in terms of what the board profile was, and got the basic building blocks. And that took time, but equally, you can't just sit every day and do it. And it went through a few iterations. And I asked one or two people whose judgment I valued and who knew me to give me a bit of critical feedback. And they did. In terms of actually starting to look for roles, that even today with you guys around is still a much more creative endeavor. No, you end up thinking you need to go talk to people. You can't do that when there's a global pandemic on. So mine was very much, it was the creative search of Google. It was sending my CV to one or two of the more traditional headhunters. It was also happily getting a recommendation to join Nurole. And and after that, it was just the hard yards of thinking, I know what I'm looking for. I will apply for, on Nurole, certainly, anything that comes up which fits who I am. And also, having had a quick look at the board, I can think, actually, I can see that I would complement some of that as opposed to just be somebody else who's got marketing and communications. So there's a lot of creativity to it, a lot of randomness, but hopefully built on a solid base.
One of the things that strikes me as very interesting, given how competitive it is getting a lot of these roles, is the amount of snake oil, I think, that's out there around the dark arts of creating this magical CV or magical
Yep.
LinkedIn profile or optimizing for some intelligent AI that's going to get you
Yep.
matched. I mean, the reality is of what we see is there are a lot of really capable people out there who
Yep.
can get these board roles and are capable of doing these board roles. The challenge is how do you make yourself stand out?
Yep.
And it's no good being a really fast runner who's able to run 100 meters in 11 seconds if you've got Usain Bolt in the lane
Yep.
next door.
Yep.
How did you think about your differentiators? Coming from a marketing background, I imagine that was one of your great strengths. How did you go about that?
Yeah, I mean that is the nub of the whole challenge, to be honest. Because you know what, you can be a marketeer, but actually having to market yourself, I find much harder. So I did spend a lot of time on the personal value proposition, and where I concluded was I need to show what I know, what I've done. But I also actually need to show what I believe in. Now, if you're being hired to join a board, I think people need to know what you're passionate about in the sector, what really gets you going, what you have a strong opinion on and why. So for me, my value proposition, my differentiator, because there are lots and lots of people who've done what I've done as a marketing director in the investment space. My view was I needed to get across not just what I'd done, but what I believed in, because that's the probably only bit that's really personally me.
I think you're probably being very modest there. I mean, you've had an amazing scale up story as an executive. When you were at interview, did you
Mhm.
feel people picking up on that, or did you feel people were actually picking up on those values?
I think once I got in the room to have the conversation, then the fact that I could evidence my views with what I'd done and I'd been in the trenches of building teams starting with a sales target. And not all marketeers start with a sales target, but in my last executive job, I can promise you, I had a sales target. So yes, I think once you're in the room and you're having the conversation, being able to point to what was done, what was difficult, and what was achieved, what you learned from it, with hard evidence of both the numbers, but also the challenges, what you wouldn't do again. That I think that's very compelling. But I'm sure somehow the values sort of sprinkle through as you're talking. But bluntly, the values on their own aren't going to work. I mean, you have to be able to point to the evidence.
Now, I think you've got 2 roles now through the Nurole platform, and I hope you won't mind me saying I think there've been some where you've also been unsuccessful. I think people
Yeah.
just see the successes and assume that it was
Yeah.
all rosy.
No.
Lots of people I speak with find that being unsuccessful very difficult to deal with, especially when, like you, they've come from very successful executive careers, and when they're
Yeah.
suddenly being unsuccessful, none of us deal with rejection easily. How did you navigate that?
3 things probably. And to start with, yeah, it's disappointing. And the nearer you get to something, the more you've invested and the more that you've shown of yourself. So it feels a far more personal blow when you get the silver or bronze medal than when you don't get the interview to start with. So my navigation techniques were probably, I'd say, threefold. One, you can only be thoroughly cheesed off about this for 24 hours. Have a think about it. If you think when you were in the room, you gave the best possible account of yourself with what you had, then you can't kick yourself. You know what? Somebody else was, whatever reason, more suited to the job. And I think the next point is you have to accept that boards may well find as they're interviewing that what they think they're looking for changes. So my third point is once you know the candidate chosen is in the public domain, go and have a look at them and just think, okay, that is an extremely credible, very smart candidate. And either they simply had a different background to me. They said they wanted a marketeer, but actually they chose, somebody who had a different core set of skills, or that person came from a world that they decided was more valuable. I think just doing that and having a look and saying, well, okay, just got to be a grown up here and think that was a smart person who, for whatever reason, the board decided was a better fit for them than I am. And you can't be a good fit for everything.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought of the roles where one gets closest to and misses out as being more difficult. Because I suppose from where I sit, once I see someone getting close to those roles, if you're getting interviews and not getting it at an interview,
Yeah.
it's invariably then just a matter of time before you get one. You just got to persevere.
Yeah.
Whereas the ones where, I suppose looking at it from the outside, that I'd be most disappointed about, the ones that I didn't even get on the short list
Yeah.
for. So it's really interesting to
Yeah.
hear that. How did you prepare for your interviews once you sort of started getting through to that interview stage? What was the preparation you did? Because for a lot of people, that's a really tough thing to do if they haven't done it before.
I always started with, a good forensic look at the business that I was being interviewed by. It's easier these days than it was 25 years ago too. So nobody can really not have the material at their fingertips. So I would always do a good look at their business, what I saw of their challenges, given what I know about whatever sector they were in, which has always been the investment sector. And from that, try to work out what I thought I could talk to them about in respect of what I could bring to the board, given what I presumed could be their challenges. I'd also have a good look at the actual board and what their experience was. And therefore, would I be complementary to them? Would I be a value add because I had a different set of experiences or a different way of approaching issues? And you can't know that, but all you can do is sort of do your due diligence. And so I think in the early days, I probably over prepared, which is you invest too much then. And then you're upset if you think, well, why didn't they ask me that question? So it took me a while to prepare well, but not over prepare, because I think that is also just a waste of time.
Interesting. One of the bits of advice I give people if they ask me what should I do, I encourage them to do what Fisher would have called scuttlebutt.
Yeah.
Of going and not just reading the annual reports and the website, but trying to go and talk to employees, past employees, competitors, doing site visits if they have
Mm.
sites, obviously harder
Yeah.
with an investment trust.
Yeah.
Was there anything like that you did beyond just sort of reading what was out on the web?
Well, one or two of the positions I went for, in fact, I think the two I'm thinking of are both ones that I got close, but not close enough. They were both actually with companies that in my previous executive life, but when I was much younger, I'd had, quite a lot to do with. So I could find my way around having conversations with people about those quite easily. And so when I could, I would do that. And it can be valuable because it gives you insight that you're not going to get from a piece of paper or a website. And also, if I thought I could find a way to find out something about just the chemistry of the board by asking somebody who might already be on a board and know somebody, then obviously that gets easier once you've got one or two positions because then you've got some people to ask. But I found that also was valuable because then you don't walk in the room knowing the people, but you walk in the room and you have a little more confidence just in yourself that you're thinking about how to pitch yourself because you've got a tiny bit of insight into the other humans on the other side of the desk.
Really interesting. Now, so you've done all this preparation before going into the interview. How did that then marry up with the questions
Hmm.
that you got asked? And I'm really interested to hear about some of the good questions you've been asked, as well as the less good
Yeah.
questions. Because for people who are coming to that for the first time, that I think is one of the most terrifying things: is not knowing what to prepare for and
Yeah.
precisely what sort of questions they might get asked.
I think the standard questions which get asked at some point have in all of my investment related interviews have always been around why do you want to join us? And what do you see as the contribution you could bring given what you know about us? So then they're quite broad, but they allow you to talk about, your own previous experience and marry that to what you understand about their current challenges. So I got to ask those in various forms each time. The question I found terribly difficult the first couple of times I got blindsided by it was, so tell me about your career. They think, oh, my career's been quite long actually. And where would you like me to start? But you can't say that. So after I'd been somewhat shocked by that one, I then prepared so I could get 32 years down to 5 bullet points in my head and share it if I had to. And then they could, pick where they wanted to go with it. And I suppose other than that, the question that caught me on my toes, actually in a position I did actually get to join the board was, so tell us what you think about the challenges of the investment trust sector over the next 10 years. And I did have views, but I hadn't prepared on that. And I don't know why, because it was a very fair question. So that was almost an exercise in thinking on my feet, taking a moment and amassing what I knew and putting it together cogently rather than, having my bullet points in my head. So sometimes you just have to be able to think on your feet and use the data you've got.
Gosh, that sounds terrifying. As
Was.
a question to have to answer on the fly. And is there anything that you know now that
Yeah.
you would have been better off knowing when you started for those interviews?
The only thing you really would be better off knowing, you can't, because it's that you will get the other side of them. You will build some rapport. You will have the odd question that you think actually can't answer that. So I'll be honest and say, if you want a technical person for this role, actually, you don't want me, but I'm quite smart. I can learn about that stuff, but it's not what I bring you on day one. And I suppose I got better at being clear about what I didn't bring and said, but I'm very, very open to wanting to learn more and didn't try to tell people that I could do stuff I couldn't because there's no point.
Brilliant. Now, one of the things that I noticed you did, which is something we often encourage people to think about, is you took on a pro bono
Yeah.
role first, and we never suggest that anyone does one as a stepping stone to getting
No.
a paid role. because if things go wrong and you're not truly passionate about that role, then
Yeah.
it's just horrendous.
Yeah.
But it does help, I think, to build up experience and understanding that will both make you better at interview and
Yeah.
also in a paid board role. But how has that played out for you? What has your experience in that pro bono work played in your compensated board work?
The very first point is you're trying to join a club where you don't have the right badge to start with. So the moment that you get a role, you've joined the club. And I was not looking in the particular education sector deeply, but I was using another online platform and I saw this role. And the reason that, again, this was a serendipity moment, it's a multi-academy trust that is based in the area I grew up, an area that desperately needs to have improved education. To be honest, I wouldn't have gone for that role if it had been local to me in London, because it didn't have the same resonance. And so it was a pure serendipity moment. The moment I saw it, it made sense. It's like, yeah, I really care about this because I understand that community. I understand what they need. And in terms of actually having won the role and doing it, the education sector is, for me, very different because it's very much about governance. No, it's not an advisory role. My two investment trust roles, they're not household names. We are doing, a certain amount, which is kind of veers to the advisory. It's not pure governance because of the nature of the size and the ambition of those investment trusts. But my education role is absolutely governance. And where my heart really lights up is not another meeting about the strange funding arrangements that I've learned a lot about from central government. My heart lights up when I go to my Link school, and it's a little primary school in the very north of England. And then I think I'm a tiny, tiny, tiny part of something that really matters for children whose world is hard. They have a food bank in that school and it's used by the local community. And my contribution is tiny, but that's the bit that makes me light up. It's not the governance meetings, if I'm truly honest, but you can't have one without the other.
Really interesting. Funny enough, I've had past guests on the podcast who've been talking about the education space where they've said, I've challenged them on that, saying, isn't it all about the governance?
Mm.
And they pushed back on that and said, no, there's plenty of scope to do the advisory piece. So I'm really interested to hear your perspective on what is it that do you think blocks you from doing more of that advisory role, and maybe also what is it
Yeah.
exactly you mean by governance? Because I think different people will
Yeah.
refer to different things with that.
I suppose with the governance, I mean very much the triangulation of the board of directors, being, in a school and seeing what's been reported to them, having it reported to them in the board meeting, and having external parties also reporting it so that, everybody's seeing the same thing about the success of the curriculum. And therefore we can hand on heart say that we are doing what is necessary to forward the education for these children. I think the reason that we don't stray into very much advisory, in a way, is the strength of the executive team of that particular multi-academy trust. It's led by extremely able chief executive. It started as one school 10 years ago. It's now 14. It's becoming the multi-academy of choice in that region. So they don't need a huge amount of the type of advisory that possibly I can offer, but they do need it from the guy who chairs the Audit and Risk Committee. It's just about what your given expertise is. But I came at it very much from the point of view of wanting to be involved also, because I have a personal, very deep-seated view on the importance of special educational needs. And so I suppose that's what I feel I bring to the board, that the chief executive will always know that I'll always be the person who says, but that's all very well on the curriculum, but what about children who find the curriculum hard to access? And so you find your niche and you find your way to make a difference, but it is, I still maintain, very much governance. It's not advisory.
Got it. Okay, really helpful. One of the things that we've started picking up a lot through the community that we've launched, where we bring board members together to discuss challenges with their peers,
Mhm.
is how many feel quite unsupported through that first part
Mhm.
of the journey, the onboarding piece. So
Yeah.
organizations go out there, find really good people, and then leave them a little bit to sink or swim. One of the podcast guests we had was an individual called Owen Eastwood, who's a performance coach, and
Yeah.
he talked about the importance of creating a sense of belonging on boards. And
Yes.
he says there are lots of organizations where they say, well, let's give them 18 months to get up to speed and to settle in. And he rejects that. And he says, that's not a high performance team. A high performing team is one that gets going on day one.
Yeah.
Were there any people, chairs, fellow board members who really helped you get going? Were there particular actions that people took that really made you feel I belong and I'm
Yeah.
ready to add value from an early
Yeah.
stage?
I think actually with bit of my remunerated positions, I've been hugely fortunate in that they have very quickly said to me, could you lead on that? Could you go and talk with distribution on that? And therefore, if you're given a sense of purpose from a very early stage as to, I think they know pretty well what they wouldn't ask me to lead on because that's not my core competence. So I think it was a mixture of being given something and it being taken as read that I would be able to add value on it very quickly. So I felt useful. At the same time, I think that also fosters a sense of trust, which means that as the newest board member, you're happy to make yourself vulnerable and say, could somebody just explain that to me one more time? Or, can I come and sit with you and you explain XYZ around the fund administration points? There's things that understanding them intellectually is different from having the intuitive understanding of them that some of my fellow board members have. It's about getting that balance. And I've been very fortunate with both of my remunerated boards that they've taken that approach.
Brilliant. And has there been anything that's surprised you in any of your onboarding experiences?
I suppose a school's onboarding is different because it's a very different sector. It's much more, if I say formal, that's not to say that the other two were not formal, but I think actually the word I'm looking for is regimented. There is, if you think financial services are extremely regulated as they ought to be, the education sector is every bit as regulated as it should be. However, it feels, and maybe this is because it's not my world, it's not where I grew up, it feels very, very wordy, everything. Having lived through a couple of very, very smart chief executives whose constant response to anything was make it more concise. I live in a world of multi-academy trust onboarding, which it just felt like things took a lot longer than they needed to. And maybe that was because they're very thorough and they need to be, but I found some of it was just slow.
Yeah, it's always a really interesting challenge and balance to strike
Yeah.
that, isn't it? It feels like some
Yeah.
of those regulated sectors and education, my mind falls into that category,
Yeah.
have suffered from someone trying to legislate to protect the 1% that has ended
Yeah.
up harming the 99%. And
Yeah.
it's so difficult to know, has that been the right thing to do?
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely.
or has everything collectively suffered more as a result of that?
Yes.
But it takes a brave person to say, well, we can afford to have that thing go wrong from the 1% of
Yeah. It does.
cases.
It does very much.
How do you deal with that as a board member? Have you ever found that's come up yet where you've had an opportunity to steer a board in one direction or another on that front?
Recently, we had a strategy session with my pro bono board, and it was great because we ran out of time. So came up with this great suggestion that instead of everybody getting 25 minutes to stargaze on whatever the particular subjects were, we did a speed dating around the room. It was like, right, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to go around, I don't know, it was 15 of us in the room. everybody has to come up with their first immediate answer to this question, and then you move on. And we've got to finish this by 7 p.m. And it just totally changed the entire tone of everything we'd been doing, because people were just actually coming out with what they thought, their immediate response. There wasn't a lot of caveating and a lot of deferring to others. It was like, I think this is the most important thing in primaries, and this is why. And that's an enforced deadline. And somebody coming up with, let's do it this way. And they probably thought I was an absolute nutcase, but it just changed the energy in the room.
I love that. Is that something you're carrying on with? What could other boards listening to that be going, that sounds interesting. How do I bake that into what we do?
I think it's about finding ways to practically interact with each other. And obviously you have to have all of the disciplines of the board papers and everything like that. But when you're not actually in a formal board meeting, there are times when actually just getting a lot more practical interaction between us, as opposed to only interacting when we have formal documents, means that we maybe cover some stuff which is much more forward looking and also allows us all to think a little more creatively. And okay, that has its place. It can't be all the time, but not constantly having to say, let's not have a drafting committee. Let's have a conversation about what we want to do with the website. We're not going to draft the words for it. That's total nonsense. That's not our job. But sometimes boards can get very into the details and the weeds. And having been a marketeer, I've had my copy marked so many times. I know that that's not going to achieve very much.
Love that. The way you're talking about that, it's interesting. It makes it sound like there was a release of pent up thoughts and ideas. I've just come back from an offsite with a bunch of other scale up CEOs where they had us looking into each other's eyes and hugging. And when they first suggested this was going to happen, I looked for the exit and I was like, you've got to be joking. But what was extraordinary to me was by the end of it, the oxytocin and serotonin flowing around that group was off the charts. And suddenly the relationships that were formed in a very short period of time were off the charts. And I was talking actually in one of our recent community sessions about this. And one of the people around the table chuckled and said, you know what? In one of my boards, we all hug each other. And it's the highest performing board that I've ever been exposed to. And it just made me think, gosh, is there something that's happening in boards where you do need to break down those, should we be hugging more in the boardroom? I mean, that's extreme, but listening to you, it sounded like there was a release there that particular activity you did opened up, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it just transformed the energy in the room into something really, I don't know, just there was more life. And it wasn't that anybody had any probably new ideas from the ones they'd been going through extremely slowly on pieces of paper, but it just forced people to be more intuitive, more open, and just not quite so worried about choosing exactly the right word.
Got it. Yeah. Love it. Jane, the time has flown by. It's time to move on to 6-question quickfire, where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response, if that's all right. The first up is best book every board member should read and why?
Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Because human thinking is fascinating, because we're not all thinking like rational economists, and because the evolutionary brain is a huge part of how we make decisions. And we should all, as board members, really understand a lot more of the psychology of how we come to those decisions. And if we know more about our own biases as well, then maybe we'll make better decisions.
Love that. Just reading The Elephant in the Mind, which is all about how we delude ourselves consciously and unconsciously. So really interested in that in the boardroom. Your favorite quote and why?
I've got two. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And there's an argument as to whether that's Einstein or a sociologist called William Bruce Cameron. I like that a lot because I think we're all a little over obsessed by the only thing of value has to have a number attached to it. But my other one is KBO, keep buggering on. Because to be honest, an awful lot of getting to be a Ned is just being resilient.
Brilliant. Love that. Your most significant professional insight?
Okay, this is something that I was told by a very, very dear old friend who's long dead when I was working in my very early years in the late 1980s. And he said to me when I was expressing some frustrations that I had to remember, quote unquote, that you are at the forefront of a revolution, not the end of one. Now, he was obviously talking about the advent of women into the workplace as complete equals. But I think that's still very true today, that it's all constantly evolving. And there's a different revolution going on now, but it's still very pertinent.
Your favourite podcast?
The rest is politics. I really love Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell disagreeing agreeably. I think they do it so well, and they both have passionately held positions on things. And the way they can communicate their differences and challenge each other is something that as board members, I think we could all learn from.
Brilliant, love that. And finally, what 3 things should anyone listening take away from this podcast?
You've got to hone your value proposition and you've got to know what your differentiators are. As we said earlier, it's between expertise and beliefs. Secondly, looking for NED roles is not a full-time job. It just isn't. You have to have other things in your life that are helping your sanity and sustaining you and keeping you moving forward. And number 3, again, we also talked a little around this earlier. You've got to accept that boards can change their minds. They maybe decide through the process of interviewing that they're looking for somebody slightly different to how they thought they were. And that will have either favorable or an unfavorable impact on whether you get chosen. But you just got to accept it.
Jane, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, and what a lovely conversation. What a brilliant board member you are. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.